Okay, so this just outlines the process to date. We released a draft ordinance in January, and we've had a public comment period on that initial draft that ends on Monday, April 7th. You can email any comments to creekbuffers@santabarbaraca.gov. You can also sign up for appointments to talk about any issues or your property or how your property might be affected online at our website. You can also just contact me anytime at the information on your screen. And in addition, we're having these 2 webinars right now. This is just the initial comment period. You can submit comments really anytime, but if you want your comments incorporated into edits to the ordinance, then submit them by April 7th. After April 7th, we'll be spending several months revising the ordinance. And then we will release a revised draft ordinance around end of summer. We'll have another series of stakeholder meetings going through any changes to the ordinance. We'll have an open house and webinars again. And then after that process, we'll be going to the Sustainability Council Committee and Creeks Committee for comments. And then after all that, we'll start our recommendation to approve process. So it will go to Planning Commission, Ordinance Committee, City Council, and then California Coastal Commission. And really the soonest that would all occur is sometime in winter. So just to go through what a creek buffer is, it's just a natural area between a creek and new development as shown in this slide. And it's measured horizontally from the top of bank to the edge of your development. So the purpose of creek buffers are to reduce public safety risks from erosion and flooding, to limit needed alterations to the creek. We see a lot where people try to protect development by putting concrete and other things in the creek, and that can actually cause more erosion downstream in other places. So we really want to limit alterations of creeks that make flows go faster downstream. We also want to enhance water quality and protect riparian and aquatic habitats that are protected by the state and our city general plan. And we want to preserve scenic beauty. So today the city has a number of buffer policies and regulations in place. Our general plan directs the establishment of minimum creek buffer regulations to address cumulative hazard and biological impacts. In addition, there is a set 25-foot setback from Mission Creek only right now, and that's from the 1960s. As part of any permit required through the city discretionary permit, if you come in for a permit right now for a new structure that requires like design review or another type of approval, you have to undergo what's called CEQA compliance. It's environmental review. And as part of that, applicants are now determining their buffers based on applicant prepared technical reports, and it's determined on a case-by-case basis. And this process really has proven very cumbersome and expensive for applicants. And so one of the big goals of this ordinance is to accomplish our compliance with state mandates and CEQA and our general plan by providing clear buffer regulations instead of it being a case-by-case situation based on expensive technical reports. In addition, our housing element actually directs the creation of objective creek buffer standards in order to provide assurance and clarity to housing projects, because the buffers are determined on a case-by-case basis now. That the housing element really directed that it would provide more housing to have clear buffer regulations. So when the city updated this coastal land use plan in 2019, we included creek buffer regulations in that plan. Those apply only in the coastal zone, so only the area closest to the coast in the city. And those include buffers from the top of bank of creeks ranging from 35 feet to 50 feet. In addition, it includes additional buffers for environmentally sensitive habitat areas, some areas like riparian and wetland vegetation. So those are in effect now in the coastal zone. In addition, the city has existing federal floodplain regulations. So FEMA and the federal government has many regulations for what's called the floodway and floodplain. And those are incorporated already into City Municipal Code Title 2224. But even though they're in the municipal code and we are enforcing it, they are originally federal regulations. And so people get confused quite a bit about the difference between a floodplain and a floodway. So a floodplain is an area where new or rebuilt structures must be flood-proof to a certain base flood elevation because water can pool in that area. The floodway is a much more dangerous area where you see quick flowing water and debris during big storms and creeks. So really like the creek bed area. And there are very strict limitations, federal limitations for new development in those areas. It requires a verification of negative effect to flood levels. So if you want to take a look at these federal regulations that exist now, they can be found again in Title 2224. The maps can be seen on our city maps system. And in addition, you can see them on our FEMA website. This ordinance does not change these federal regulations, but a lot of people don't know that they are in effect or that they affect their properties now. And so I just wanted to point that out. So the goals of the proposed ordinance are to have an objective citywide creek ordinance for all areas of the city except for the airport where specific setbacks for Goleta Slough apply. Again, this ordinance doesn't affect FEMA floodplain regulations or associated FEMA flood insurance rates. We want them to be as objective as possible and straightforward as possible, that they maximize protections while avoiding impacts to property owners. We're really trying to encourage redevelopment to reduce safety risk and make sure that homeowners are assured that they can rebuild and if they can make basic safety findings. In addition, we want to make sure that we're ensuring our housing mandates, making sure we can build new housing in the city and prepare ourselves for wildfires. So the ordinance currently exempts things like fuel modification, vegetation management, and home hardening that are required to prepare for a wildfire. So we don't want this ordinance to affect people's preparations for a wildfire or fire insurance rates. In addition, we want the buffer distances to be able to be achieved at most parcels, and we want a modification process for when buffers can't be met so that even constrained lots can be rebuilt. So the development of the minimum buffer distances has taken several years, and there was been a number of studies done on our creeks, looking at erosion rates and bordering habitat areas, the conditions of our creeks. In addition, we've looked at the configurations of existing parcels and development to see what kind of buffers were achievable for the most amount of parcels while still protecting these areas. And in addition, we reviewed other jurisdictions. So just most other jurisdictions in the state already have creek buffer ordinances. Santa Barbara is pretty late into the game. Santa Barbara County has had a buffer ordinance for a very long time. Theirs is 50 feet for urban creeks and 200 feet for major rivers. The city of Goleta just passed a creek buffer ordinance that's 100 feet from top of bank, and city of Carpinteria is 50 feet. So the proposed minimum buffers in the ordinance are 50 feet from the top of bank from major creeks. Where we have public flood control projects, so those are areas where we are maintaining bank stabilization in certain areas, especially on Mission Creek. in the downtown area, the setback from that is 35 feet. And then anything else that meets the definition of a creek, but is not one of the major creeks or public flood control reaches, is considered a minor creek. So I get this question a lot, what constitutes a creek? Our definition is the same as that as the state fish and game code, which already has jurisdiction over the creek. And so for minor creeks, our goal is really just to keep, make sure that people aren't unintentionally blocking flow or redirecting flow on minor creeks. Because what we see a lot is people during the dry season unintentionally putting stuff or structures in those minor creeks because they don't realize that they flow. And then during winter, we see that flows get redirected onto people neighboring properties and other unfit areas. So our goal with the minor creeks is really just to limit obstructions to flow. So the ordinance applies to only daylighted sections of creeks. And this is a screening map that the city has had in place since the 90s as to what constitute a potential creek in the city. The dark blue lines are major creeks, the light blue lines are potential minor creeks, and the purple line are the public flood control projects. So the ordinance also includes a definition and multiple demonstrations of how to determine top of bank. And this is consistent with how top of bank is determined both at the county and also through our coastal land use plan. So the proposed ordinance, again, it only applies to new development or substantial redevelopment, which is basically when a structure is completely redeveloped. It applies again to only above ground sections of creek. It includes allowed uses or allowed new development in the buffers. It includes a process to reduce buffers for constrained lots. And it also outlines a process for non-conforming structures or existing structures that are in the buffers. In addition, it ensures that you can rebuild after a disaster with safety findings. So non-conforming development, or that's existing legal development that's within the buffer areas. It may be repaired, maintained. Additions are allowed if they do not increase the nonconformity, meaning that the addition is outside the buffer or away from the buffer. You can also do change of use. You can do complete interior remodels and alterations. It's only when you are completely redeveloping a building that you would have to comply with the buffers or apply for a modification to the buffers. So there's a number of things allowed without any advanced approval in the buffers, things like debris removal, abatement of emergency conditions, vegetation maintenance, fuel modification, again, for fire protection purposes, planting of native plants, maintenance and repair of existing roads and right-of-ways, and parking lots. In addition, there's a number of things that already require a building permit. And as part of that process, there's something called a zoning clearance. So basically, when you go to get a building permit, it's sent around to zoning to see if any additional permits are required. It's called a zoning clearance. And so this is a list of things that when you go in for your building permit, if you meet this list, then the zoning clearance will say you don't need any additional permits. So you just need your building permit. So that includes things like habitat restoration, public access ways and trails, lighting, fences, removal of hazardous trees, stormwater management, and ADA improvements. So modifications to reduce the buffers or to allow additional development in buffers can be approved by the Planning Commission in the following cases on severely constrained lots. So for vacant lots, the people want to develop for single family, you could build within the buffer if you have a constrained lot, 1,200 square foot house, a garage and accessory uses. You can substantially redevelop or replace at least the same size structure that you have now, plus a garage and accessory uses, all within the buffer. In addition, for multifamily lots, you can build up to the maximum number of units currently allowed by the zoning code within the buffer. And you can also get a modification if you need to stabilize creek banks to protect existing legal development. This modification, because it involves work within the buffer or within the creek, does require technical reports to make sure you're not affecting flow or erosion of neighboring areas, and that your structures will be safe from erosion. And in addition, the modifications require findings that your development is as far away as possible from the creek. So accessory dwelling units are allowed outside the buffers if they're state mandated ADUs, which is a whole suite of type of ADUs, and it can't fit outside the buffer. They are allowed inside the buffer with just a geologist report addressing safety, and that's done as part of that building permit process. Additionally, oh, I mentioned the multifamily housing, yes. So we've received a number of questions and comments to date, so I wanted to just go through what those, the type of questions and comments that we've gotten to date, and hopefully answer some of your questions and you can hear what other people are saying. We've had a lot of questions about impacts on existing structures and repairs. Again, this ordinance does not affect existing structures, and you can repair and remodel existing structures. It's only when you go to completely rebuild that you would have to try to rebuild outside the buffer, and if you can't, you can still rebuild up to your existing square footage and more in some cases with technical reports. We've had a lot of questions about minor creeks, so either comments supportive of the buffers because people have had a lot of drainage issues with neighbors, and also concerns that their drainages are too small to be considered creeks and that the ordinance will limit accessory structures. And then we've also heard concerns with determining top of bank of minor creeks. And so because of some of those concerns, we are looking at changes to the minor creeks. One thing we're looking at is taking the 15 feet from the center line of the creek, just to avoid a whole process with top of banks for these minor creeks. But we're not looking at a number of issues to try to simplify that process, because really, again, we're just trying to make sure that flow isn't blocked in some way on the minor creeks. We've had a lot of questions about rebuilding after natural disasters. As I mentioned, the way the ordinance is currently written, you are allowed to rebuild, but you do have to rebuild if you're rebuilding in the buffers as far away from the creek as possible and with technical reports. This is an area where we've heard a lot of comments, and so we are considering whether we can outright exempt fire rebuilds in place. So that's something we're looking at. We've had a lot of questions about impacts of flood and fire insurance rates. Again, the ordinance doesn't impact, and we are working on edits to really clarify that, anything to do home hardening, clear around your property for fire purposes, or do vegetation maintenance, and all those things that would affect your fire insurance rates are allowed without any type of approval as part of the ordinance, and we're really working to clarify that in the ordinance. In addition, as I mentioned, we're looking at the fire rebuild exception, so it's really clear that you can definitely rebuild. As far as flood insurance rates are based again on your maps that FEMA produces. And so this ordinance does not impact either way those maps. And we've heard a lot of concerns about property values. We've heard support to reduce hazards and to protect creek habitats. And then we've heard a lot of complaints about neighbors' activities in or near creeks, and then also requests for the city and county. to maintain the creeks. Other requests that we've gotten is for to have a higher trigger for the definition of substantial redevelopment. So that is something that we are looking at, whether or not we can make the trigger for when when a redevelopment is considered a new development higher, so you really are demolishing pretty much the whole building. So that's something we're definitely looking at. We've had a lot of requests for more uses in the buffers, a lot of like backyard type uses. And I think that we should be able to accommodate some of those things, especially in the portion of the buffer that's farther away from the creek. We've also had requests for fewer uses within the buffer and also to make the ordinance stricter. We've had requests for larger creek buffers, and then we've also had requests for smaller creek buffers. And then again, a lot of requests to maintain the creeks. So again, here's our website and contact information, and I really encourage anyone who wants to talk about their property or has additional questions to contact us. We're happy to meet with you, go through your property, or look at any issues that you have. And so with that, I want to open it up for question and answer. So if you have any questions, you can type them in the Q&A.
Yeah, Melissa. So at this time, there's no questions, but as Melissa said, please feel free to type those in to that Q&A section. All right, here's our first question. Thank you. We're in the process of planning a redesign of our backyard, which backs up to a creek for things like a new patio or retaining wall. Would the buffer ordinance apply?
So that's one area where there's not much clarification in the ordinance that we're really looking at. Mike, thank you for that question. That's a really good question. I do think we'll be editing the ordinance to be clear that things like needed retaining walls and like paver patios could be located in portions of the buffer. But right now it's not very clear in the ordinance.
Okay, gonna go to the next one. What is the scientific background for this ordinance? Aren't there already requirements for safety?
So yes, so the floodplain ordinance addresses actually the flood proofing a structure, but what it doesn't account for is erosion that occurs in creeks, which can cause structures to fail. In addition, we are required by the state and our general plan to not only reduce hazards, but also protect what's called riparian habitats or creekside habitats. And so in addition, as part of our general plan process, we have as part of environmental review, as part of that process, it was determined that the city does need more protections for creek buffers now, and that if we don't put in a creek buffer ordinance, that there would be a cumulative environmental impact. And so the general plan currently requires a creek buffers. And so there's a number of reasons why we need the creek buffer ordinance. It's not just safety, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, so the next one is, in addition to fires, what about earthquake and floods being additionally exempt? The comment is an existing structure should be able to be rebuilt to how it is now.
For floods and damage from creek erosion, if a structure was completely had a complete loss because of those things and had to be completely rebuilt, we would want to try to see the structure, if possible, built farther away from the creek to try to reduce the hazard. And so that is consistent with how most jurisdictions do disaster rebuilds, including Santa Barbara County and City of Goleta. Both those other jurisdictions also require the same thing for any natural disaster. I think the fire rebuild is a more likely to be a complete loss, and so we are again looking at exempting that. We can also look at earthquake. What we've found with the other hazards, fire is really unique in that you can have these complete losses that require complete rebuilds. But for things like floods, and earthquake, we see a lot more where people have to do repairs, but it doesn't rise to a level of like completely redoing your structure usually. And if it does, I think that is a point. So you could repair like a flood damage without triggering the buffer ordinance, because you're repairing a non-conforming structure. So, if one of those events were truly to cause a total loss, I think we'd really want to look at why. And if there are things like a landslide or something else that help attribute to that total loss. And again, we'd be wanting to, in everybody's interest, look at a safer area on the property if that's possible. And if not, then it could be located within the buffer, but we do need technical reports showing that it's designed to be safe.
So I'm gonna go to the follow-up to this question. Let's jump ahead. So the question is, can we rebuild on a constrained lot to the original size without, I'm not sure what that means. I think he means without a modification.
So you can build anything outside the buffer without the modification. If you're going to completely rebuild within the buffer, you do have to get the modification that requires the safety findings. And I guess I would just say right now, if you completely rebuilt, you would likely trigger other permits anyways, like design review, that would already require these technical reports associated with creek setbacks. So we're really just writing down those requirements. If that makes sense.
Yeah, and then the follow-up is that's the notice that's a problem and potential appeal process or lack of one, specific to this. So it's more of a comment, but I'll just put it out there. Okay, moving on. If you have an existing retaining wall that is literally in the creek, I think it's a what if you have.
So yeah, it depends on what your options are. So with structures in the creek, we really want to see them moved out of the creek or not redirecting flows if possible. So if you completely rebuilt that, we would try to see if it could be moved back. If you need it to protect existing structures from erosion or failure, then it could be allowed. But again, we would need technical reports to show that what you're building is not affecting downstream erosion or your neighbor's erosion problems, because we see that a lot.
And Melissa, I'll just add that, if that's existing and not proposed to be modified, then that's, not impacted by the ordinance. It's if you are trying to modify that.
Yeah, only if you're completely, and I would just say that currently, right now, rebuilding an entire retaining wall in the creek would require a number of permits. So our federal floodplain regulations regulate that, requires a permit from California Department of Fish and Game. It can require an Army Corps permit in some cases. So if you're doing work in the creek now, all this technical analysis and a whole suite of permits are already required. So really the city is just documenting that process.
Okay, so there's a couple questions about what motivated the work on this ordinance. Can you give a couple examples of problems that have happened in city creeks that prompted this ordinance?
It wasn't specific problems that prompted the ordinance. We've honestly should have had a creek buffer ordinance like decades ago. And it's come up time over time with city council as a goal, but and now a requirement of several of our plans and as part of our CEQA processes. In addition, this process would really streamline what is now a case by case and very cumbersome process. And so that is really the biggest goal of the ordinance, is to have clear rules that everybody has to abide by, so the process isn't as discretionary and subjective as it is now and expensive. But we have in the last few years, just like side note, had a lot of erosion on our creeks with these big events. We've had structures fall into the creeks. We've had multiple issues of stuff that people have put in the creeks, pulling away from the creeks and causing more erosion. In addition, I think after the Montecito debris flow, council really directed the city to really get this going and to have clear creek buffer regulation.
Okay, I'm gonna jump to one that's sort of related to a previous one. If a creek bank erodes and breaks off into the creek, are we allowed to rebuild that and put in a mechanism where the creek wall or bank will not fail into the creek again?
So
And
again, this
yeah.
is similar to the retaining wall question. If you're protecting an existing legal structure and you have no other means to protect it, then you can apply for a permit to alter the creek bank. But again, a whole suite of permits are already required for that, along with these technical reports that we were talking about earlier. So it really depends on your situation, but I guess I would say that the ordinance is arguably less strict than existing state and federal regulations regarding that.
Yeah, the follow-up to this, Melissa, sorry, I didn't finish, was they had a neighbor who had to get over 5 different jurisdictional permits for this issue. He got 4 permits, but the last permit from Fish and Wildlife, they said no, he wasn't able to complete the work. So
yeah,
that was
so
sorry.
Existing, like doing work in the creek is an arduous permitting process for sure. And so we are not trying to make it harder. We are literally trying to outline everything that is required now. And so, yeah, especially that's why I mentioned the floodway designation, because technically in many areas, the mapped floodway is technically the creek. With regard to federal regulations and other regulations. And so any work in that area really requires a lot of permits and scrutiny. So I would take a look at the mapping of your parcels, because a lot of people don't realize that they have mapped floodway areas on their parcels. And that is where you get into a lot of restrictions, a lot of at the federal level in particular.
Okay, so sorry, I'm going to stay on this kind of realm. Okay. There's a few questions. I'm jumping around from where the questions are in the actual list, but can a retaining wall be rebuilt as is, even though it is located in a creek? I mean, I think this is very similar to the last question.
I think we've answered that question. If we haven't,
and then if a bridge exists but gets damaged severely, or the bank around it erodes, can it be rebuilt?
Yeah, so rebuilding of bridges is allowed, and in fact new bridges are allowed in certain situations if you need to access your property. Again, need the technical reports to show that it's designed properly and that it allows for enough flow under it and things like that.
Okay, let's see, there's a lot of questions kind of about the map and minor creeks. Gonna try and kind of consolidate these into one, but basically who makes the determination of a minor creek? And so that's based, as Melissa said, off that definition in the ordinance.
Yeah, the definition of the ordinance is the same as that which the state uses, so to define their jurisdiction and what's allowed in a creek. And so the ordinance applies to what on the ground meets that definition. So we have a screening map that was done by Penfield and Smith several years ago now. But that was really done on like aerial topography and other data, and is really a screening map because what's on the ground could be different. In addition, several minor creeks have been piped or covered over at this point, and those the setbacks would not apply to that area because you really wouldn't be blocking flow in those cases. And with regards to what's considered a major creek versus a minor creek, we just took a look at the watershed size, so the area above the creek that drains into the creek is often a determiner for how, during rainfall events, how much flow is going down the creek. And so basically creeks with a certain watershed size over a certain amount were considered major creeks. But again, so just as an example, like the city of Goleta has a similar definition to ours. And they just have one setback of 100 feet from all creeks. So we are doing something different because we realize that these really small creeks don't warrant such a big setback. And so that's why we even have a distinction.
And I'll just add that, as Melissa said, it's a screening tool. We are making updates to that map as we become aware of things. So if you have things that you are, you feel is not meet the definition of a creek, please send that information to us so we can try to get an updated map as best we can.
Yeah, so this has come up though, because I see some comments. Like what if there's a dispute about whether something's a creek? So this happens all the time at the state level and federal level of whether or not something meets the definition of a creek. And so we are always willing to go out and provide an idea to you of whether or not something meets the definition of a creek. But if there is a dispute, you are always welcome to hire a consultant to provide information about that determination based on the definition. And in the end, if there really was a dispute, then it would be determined by whoever is the approval authority. So associated with whether the permits were needed. So just like any definition in our code, that's the same process for any determination in our code.
And I think, Melissa, a good indicator would be if the Department of Fish and Wildlife took jurisdiction over it, then it would apply for those minor creeks.
So yeah, we have now had them get involved in several creeks, like minor creeks, in the San Roque neighborhood because of complaints and like neighbor complaints and other things. We have brought them in, and they will also make determinations since the definition is the same as theirs, and they do have jurisdiction over anything that meets that definition.
Okay, how far inland does the coastal zone extend along riparian corridors within the city's jurisdiction? And then the second part is, aren't riparian corridors natural fire breaks?
The coastal zone is generally, I believe it's 1,000 feet inland. It's basically, I could pull up a map, but
I was just going to share, I mean, it's very different across the state. I think if people are familiar with Carpinteria, their coastal zone does extend very far inland along their riparian.
Yeah, it's a mapped line. It's a actually like mapped line as opposed to like a certain distance the whole way, but it's generally in Santa Barbara, the area south of 101 in the downtown area, and then like the Mesa on kind of either side of Shoreline Drive and Cliff Drive, so that area right hugging the coast. But if you are interested in that, you can either email me, or again, if you Google City of Santa Barbara maps, there's a whole mapping system and it shows you things like the federal floodway map, your floodplain map, which is different, and then the coastal zone and other areas. But again, happy to help you find where your parcel is if you contact me.
And then the second part of that about riparian corridors being a natural fire break, generally, yes, intact riparian corridors are considered that. Those are all very water dense tree species that are fire resistant. I think there's caveats to that in that, you know, a lot of our riparian corridors are full of invaders like arundo and eucalyptus trees and things that are not fire resistant. So that's my answer to that, unless you have something else to add, Melissa.
No.
What is our current creek buffers and why do we need a 50-foot buffer?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, the answer is that we don't have a set number right now, which makes it really confusing. But generally, if you are next to a major creek and you're proposing a structure within 100 feet, we currently require technical reports in most cases to determine the setback. So that's the process now. Like technically there is only one minimum required setback in the ordinance, and that's 25 feet from Mission Creek. And that was really put in the 60s as just a basic safety ordinance without addressing other issues.
Okay, there's a couple comments about appeal process. Is there an appeal process? Yeah, I'm not really understanding.
So for things that are allowed with a zoning clearance as part of a building permit, you can appeal it to the building official, but beyond that, you can't appeal it because it's not actually a discretionary permit or determination. It's supposed to be objective enough that you either meet it or you don't. And so all building permits are only appealable to the building official now. If you try to get a reduction in buffer or modification from the planning commission and they denied it or whatever it might happen, it can be appealed to city council.
Okay, and then there's a general comment about fire rebuilds. I'm just going to acknowledge that we've heard that, and we're looking at modifying that disaster rebuild section. Here's the next question: can you expand on the modification to reduce buffers for severely constrained lots? What is the process if a modification is approved? Is it grandfathered for subsequent owners?
Oh yeah, so generally a permit approval runs with property owners. Again, different permits have different types of approvals and time limits of you having to start construction and all that kind of stuff. But the modification process it's very similar to what's currently required for discretionary permits that are requiring this environmental review now. So essentially, you would have to prepare a technical report showing that the erosion rate on the property will not affect the proposed structure within 75 years of erosion. And also showing that you're not going to like cut down riparian areas or other sensitive habitats. So that's a bioreport and a hydrology soils report. In general, for building permit, you're already required for structures to do a soils and geotechnical report anyways, usually. And so it's really, people often do it as an add-on to that. And so you would apply for the modification. Generally, if it's a whole new structure, you'll be applying for other permits anyways. So we try to combine those as much as we can. And it would go to a hearing before planning commission and either get approved or not approved. So generally, if you're building a whole new structure in the city, it generally requires a building permit, often a design review permit. And this would be a modification.
Okay, we had another question about, do you have a native plant list that you would approve for planting within the buffer zone? Who has created such a list? I just put that in the chat. Creeks Division staff working review and like consideration from the Botanic Gardens came up with that list, and I just put that in the chat. Okay. Some of these are getting really specific. Okay, what about a severely construct? Sorry, I'm going to go to this other one. It's very specific. So sorry, Melissa, you might not be able to answer it specifically, but they're saying that if they were to have to move their house, they would have to put a new fire hydrant in because that was the consideration of where their house is currently located. It needed to be a certain distance from a fire hydrant. So who would pay for this fire hydrant? It's hard for us to say, I think.
If you're completely rebuilding a structure, you have to come up to fire code and everything anyways. So that's true now. So the ordinance doesn't really apply either way in that case. So
I'm just trying to wonder if they have an existing house and they're, I'm trying to understand the scenario where they'd be completely rebuilding that house.
So then you have to come up to all the
the
city's codes at that point.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's true now.
Okay. Okay, the 50, I mean, these are more comments again. Someone stating that the buffer extends through most of their backyard into part of their house. If I need to rebuild, I can rebuild outside of the buffer, but not necessarily in the buffer where my house currently sits. I don't know if that's a question or a statement.
So if you rebuild, again, we're looking at exempting fire rebuilds, but if you completely rebuild and you have feasible space outside your buffer to get at least the square footage you have now in a garage and ADU, if not more, then, and it's not like a super steep area or something, some reason that it's not otherwise buildable or would be a problem, then yes, you would have to build outside the buffer. If that's not possible because of various situations, so you have a really steep hillside behind you, you have that would require taking out, whatever would make it infeasible to do that, then you'd be applying for the modification to rebuild. You'd still be able to rebuild, but you'd have to get the modification.
Okay, so there's another question about the online maps and the disclaimer that's currently up. And so they're asking, is the only way to get accurate information is to come in and get the city to review their property?
You can also get a consultant to come out. I mean, there's a lot of people that already work on this because the process is so arduous right now and you have to do it within 100 feet. There are a number of companies that are familiar with our process out there that could help you, but yes, we are happy to take a look at your property if you have questions, or even just take a look at it online with an aerial and kind of just discuss it.
And I'll just say, you know, there are obvious errors on the map. People have shown us of, you know, there's basically just like a little tiny concrete swale. And so we know that there are some errors with that map. As Melissa was trying to say, it was a GIS based map based on topography. So it basically took anywhere where water kind of accumulates and flows. And that's how that map was produced. So the minor creeks are not represented perfectly. But it's kind of the best tool the city has of potential creeks and watercourses at this point. Okay, sorry. What I'm trying to read these ahead, but I'm getting behind. What about severely constrained lots, which the draft does not exempt? If you have a house that's destroyed for a natural disaster and you have a constrained lot and 50 feet goes right through where your house was, do you have to apply and spend time and money to on a review process to get the decision? And then what about the appeal process is again being asked.
So I'm sorry, was the question about the modification process?
I think it's asking why, I think essentially it's asking why for natural disaster rebuilds, is there not just a straight exemption that they have to go through the modification process? And I think that goes back to what you were trying to explain earlier about.
Yeah, it's really at that point, we want to, I mean, right now, when you go to rebuild after a natural disaster, you have to bring everything up to code. Similarly, this would be the same as that. That's a pretty standard disaster rebuild clause that is, you know, Santa Barbara County again has the same one. City of Glenwood. Again, I think the only situation where we usually see complete losses is fire, and so we can definitely look at that. If that, but again, that's just exempting this ordinance. You're still required to bring things up to code and get other needed building permits and things like that. It just doesn't. Right now, you can't rebuild without any permits. That's not possible.
Okay, so is there a list of exact steps that one would have to take if they had to rebuild in a different place, permits, etc.?
It really depends on the parcel because and where the buffer lies within your parcel and what you have on the parcel and about considering, but I will tell you that as part of the development review process, there is something called a pre-application review where you can actually submit your idea for a project and it will go through the what's called the land development team, and where they can tell you all the approvals or reports and stuff that would be required for that project. And so that can be a really useful, if you have a complex lot, that can be a really useful way to kind of get all the information from all the different parts of the city, like fire department, you know, all the different requirements in one spot.
And I'll just add, Melissa, like if that were the case that they had to completely rebuild, if they built out, if they were able to, if they had space on their lot to comply with the buffer, there would be no additional permits, no additional, you know, there'd be no change.
Yeah, just say you would still have to get building permits and design, but you wouldn't have to do anything additional with
additional.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then one of the questions is with all these permits, sorry, it's like I'm a little bit struggling with punctuation on some of these, but with all these permits and the extra ones, how much is this going to cost? So
it really depends on what is required for your whatever you're proposing that's new, and the scope of that, and as to what permits are required. So I can't really answer that.
Yeah, and again, if they were able to, whatever they were doing, if it complied with the buffer being outside, there'd be no additional permits or cost.
Yeah, and we are looking at that whether or not if you know other permits are required and you require a modification too, if we can streamline it into one approval and try to streamline the permitting. So that's something we are looking at.
Okay, are concrete patios located within the buffer allowed to stay, even if the house requires substantial rebuilding?
Yes,
Um, sorry. I mean, some of these are comments. With so many questions, staff should consider having another in-person forum. Um, I will say that that is the consideration we're planning for,
Yeah.
once the new draft is out, to go through it in detail, the proposed, what changes have been made and answer questions.
we're just, yeah, if you have specific things you want to go through, we're happy to meet with you or talk to you on the phone or go or Teams you. At this point, we have a number of edits we want to make, and so we really want to make those edits to try to address some of these concerns, and then we'll have a whole outreach process again and be re-engaging with all the stakeholders, having in-person open houses, all that kind of stuff. So this is just the beginning of this process. There'll be a lot of opportunities moving forward.
Okay, when considering whether a house can be rebuilt outside the buffer, how are existing outdoor spaces like patios sitting outside of the buffer considered? I think they must have meant inside the buffer. Would the city force the owner to shrink, remove he does mean that. I think they do mean outside. So would the city force the owner to shrink or remove an existing patio to make room for the house outside the buffer? Would the
The
house
biggest
be?
goal is to get the main big structures outside the buffer. We rather see things like minor things like the patio inside the buffer rather than a big structure. So that is something where we're looking at allowed uses, things like patios. If we can allow those within the buffer, that if it's not super close to the creek bank. So in that, if we are looking at those allowed uses, so ideally you'd put your house outside the buffer. And then something like a flex zone patio or whatever it could be. Yeah, with a bit in the buffer, but again, I think that's an area of the ordinance, like backyard type uses. Is something we've been really happy to get be able to talk to a lot of the landowners and go through their properties, because it's really made us aware of all the different type of uses people are concerned about. So again, really encourage you to submit comments or talk to us, because going through all these properties and what's happening at them and the constrained lots really helps us see what kind of edits we need to make, especially to things like allowed uses in the buffer.
Okay, so what changes did the state make for rebuilding after the LA fires?
I don't know the answer.
I mean,
But I
I
know
think
they waived
CEQA requirements, so that, I mean, from a mandate from the governor. So it would take like an emergency declaration and a proclamation by the governor to kind of waive those environmental requirements.
yeah.
Okay, there's questions again about this fire hydrant, and I think it would be really helpful to look at this person's property on like individually, so we could like look at the distances and where it is situated. So I'm gonna recommend that they reach out to Melissa or I, and we'd be happy to meet with them individually, because it's hard for me to understand without a visual.
We can also put you in touch with the fire department, because they're really
Right.
helpful to deal with fire hydrants.
Yeah. And then there's a question about the city paying for the additional civil engineering and infrastructure for things that
So
are for.
most of what we're talking about for this ordinance is already required. You're already required to come up to building code to make sure things are safe. You're required to have a geotech report. So you're required to have civil engineering now. So if you're within the buffer, the additional cost is the technical report with regard to hydrology of the creek, and then maybe a bio report. So, but again, those are required now for most cases. So
There's another question on if you need to rebuild and apply, they're calling it a variance, but I think they mean the modification. What are their options for if the modification is denied? So again, the appeal process.
I would just say I've gotten a lot like, well, planning commission can deny it, but we can work on the wording, but really, if you can make the safety findings and if you can't locate your house outside the buffer, the planning commission has no basis to deny it. So part of what's good about the ordinance is it's clearly laying out the rules and what planning commission can do and can't do. Right now, those rules are not written down anywhere. So it actually takes what's a very subjective discretionary process right now and makes it more objective, if that makes sense. So it's clear what the planning commission should approve versus not.
Okay, and then there's one question about theoretically rebuilding on an elevated a home elevated like on pylons or something.
Yeah, we see that a lot.
Above the highest flood elevation. And I would say that would comply with FEMA regulations, but in this case, not necessarily this buffer requirement. But it doesn't mean that if it's a small,
what's the question?
Could they rebuild theoretically on pylons to elevate themselves above a flood elevation?
Yeah, it would be required. So when you rebuild again, right now, you have to comply with all existing regulations, including our existing federal floodplain regulations, which require your structure be either elevated or flood-proofed to a certain elevation. So that can often require different types of foundations, caissons, things like that. In addition, if you have particular situations on your property, like landslides or failures and all that, currently a geotech report could require certain types of foundations. So that's already required. So the ordinance wouldn't affect that either way, and it would allow for those type of foundations when needed. Does that answer the question? I'm not.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just if they could redevelop outside the buffer, versus put in and a mod. I mean, that's not how the question's wording, but that's how I'm interpreting it.
Outside of the buffer, you would still have to meet any floodplain regulations. You're more likely to be in a less restricted zone. So within the buffer, you're more likely to be in that like floodway area or where the floodplain regulations are stricter, where there's higher elevations. But so to the degree that you move your structure away, you could actually lower your flood insurance rates or lower your flood proofing requirements. But if your other side of your property is still in the floodplain, then you would have to meet those federal floodplain regulations, but the ordinance doesn't affect that determination either way.
But as far as trying to rebuild within the buffer under the ordinance, if they had a severely constrained lot, then they could apply for a modification.
Right.
And then there's one last question, kind of about taking whether our city attorneys has looked at this, which, yeah.
Yes. So similar to any regulation, if the city were to not allow use of your property, especially with your investment back expectations, that's if we weren't allowed, if we were restricting all use of your property, then that would be considered a takings. And so, no, consistent with most regulations of the city, we can't do that. And so, the city attorney has closely reviewed this ordinance. It does allow you to have use of your property and more in many cases, especially with multi-family and allows you to have at least your existing size structure that you have now. So generally, that's consistent with any type of property law, such as takings, and we've never, in similar ordinances, had any issues with mortgage lenders or takings and all that kind of stuff, because you're allowed to rebuild.
And that is all the questions, Melissa. So thank you for those of you that stayed on a little past 7.
Yeah, thank you for attending, you all.
And just reiterate Melissa's statement that if you have specific questions we weren't able to answer or you want to follow up, you're welcome to reach out to Melissa or myself.
Yes, please jot down these numbers on the screen or email us, or if you forget, just email creekbuffers@santabarbaraca.gov. And we are happy to talk through anything with anyone. So please feel free to reach out. And I just want to thank you all for showing interest in the ordinance and helping us to really walk through the ordinance on different properties. It really helps us determine what kind of changes we need to make to the ordinance, and it's been really useful. So thank you.